During the company party, a strange man pulled my wife by the hand in front of me and danced with her as if I were invisible. It wasn't a simple gesture. It was the way she accepted the dance, how she smiled back, how the touch between them was intimate, as if that moment was theirs, not mine, not ours. The room was packed, people laughing, toasting, the music was loud, and yet, I heard the click that made inside me when I saw his hand in his, the same hand that held mine 10 years ago, the same hand that promised loyalty, now dancing without hesitation with a complete stranger. I wanted to believe it was just a joke, a coincidence, a silly social gesture, but my stomach didn't accept the lie. I knew her body. I knew her eyes. And at that time, they were no longer with me. They didn't dance for me. And I couldn't look away. I stood there, motionless, with the glass crinkling in my hand, watching the woman who slept next to me every night being pulled away like a teenager enchanted by another man. And she went. No resistance. No hesitation. That night, the silence between us was deafening. I didn't ask, she didn't explain. But it was no longer possible to sleep next to someone who smelled like someone else's perfume, even if it was imperceptible. Something had broken. So I started investigating. No confrontation, no raising your voice, no accusations. Just observing. His name appeared too quickly, her smile lasted too many seconds after receiving messages, her cell phone facing down, calls during the shower. Small signs, which added up, screamed in my face that I was no longer the only one. And then I found him. Married. Doubly dirty. A man who not only destroyed his own home, but also crossed my door with a smile on his lips, as if he deserved applause for stealing what wasn't his. I knew right then and there that it wasn't enough to know. It was necessary to make him also feel the taste of the ground opening up under his feet. That's when I looked for his wife. And what she told me confirmed everything. It wasn't the first time. He was methodical. A predator of corporate environments. A man who turned parties and trips into hunting. But she didn't know the details. I gave her evidence. Photos, conversations, messages, details. And together we planned what came next. Not just a confrontation. A revelation. An unmasking. A scene that would leave an impression on everyone present. We plan each step with the precision of a surgeon. And we chose the same stage, the next company party. Only this time, he wouldn't ask my wife to dance. This time, the hand that would emerge would lead to his ruin. Meanwhile, at home, my wife walked around as if nothing was happening. She was more affectionate, more attentive, closer. Which hurt me more, because I knew it was my fault. She wanted to balance betrayal with kindness. He took care of me as if we were still us, but his eyes still looked away when I tried to hold them for too long. One night, after making love as if we were at the beginning of our relationship, she laid her head on my chest and said she loved me. And I, with my hand on her hair, could only think that that body was no longer just mine. She breathed calmly, thinking her lie was safe. But the storm was already brewing over our heads. The day of the party arrived. Everything was perfect. I smiled, greeted, toasted, like a passionate, faithful man, grateful for the life he had. Nobody suspected. I wore the suit she had given me on our last wedding anniversary. She looked stunning. She walked among the guests as if she were the protagonist of a film, and perhaps, in a way, she was. Until he arrived. In a dark blazer, tight tie, and the same scoundrel smile as always. The room was filled with laughter, toasts, fake smiles and blank stares. He greeted everyone, came up to me, held out his hand, and I held it tight enough to let him know, I knew. But he just laughed, as if I were a fool. And then he looked at my wife. And again, like last time, he reached out his hand. And again, she went. They danced like the first time. And I just watched. The entire hall revolved around them. The beautiful, smiling, charming couple. The music surrounded the moment like a smoke screen, and everyone's eyes turned to that informal stage, where betrayal was presented in a red dress and well-cut suit. And then, at the height of the dance, when the world seemed to have stopped to watch this dirty spectacle, I made a gesture. A simple wave. And that's when she entered. His wife. In high heels, eyes on fire, holding a microphone. The music stopped. The hall froze. The dancing stopped. And he, when he saw her, turned pale. She walked to the center of the room, like a queen without a throne, and began to speak. His voice was firm, his gaze was direct, his breathing was heavy. It revealed the full name of the man next to my wife. He talked about the years of marriage, about the lies, about the previous betrayals. And then he pointed at my wife, like pointing at a gun. He said, "This is the woman my husband is cheating on me with. And this, gentlemen, has been going on for months, within this company, among you." The hall became a graveyard of words. People looked at each other, some laughed nervously, others looked to the side, not knowing where to hide. She continued. He said he had already filed for divorce. She said she would sue her husband for moral damages. And then he revealed, to everyone, that he now worked directly with the company's president. And that, from that moment on, the lover would be investigated for misconduct and harassment. And she wasn't there alone. There were witnesses. You had records. It had power. My wife didn't know where to go. Her face seemed to melt, her eyes wide, her body trembling. She tried to get away from him, but it was too late. They were already together in everyone's eyes. There was no way to undo the image. He, in desperation, tried to justify himself, tried to deny it, tried to drown out her voice. But it was too late. The damage was done. But what they didn't know yet was that this was just the first part. Because at that same moment, the president of the company discreetly called me to the stage. With a smile on his face, he introduced me as the new associate director. It was my first public appearance in the position that I had quietly won in the previous weeks. Everyone applauded. Including her, still not knowing what was coming. It was then that I said, "It's an honor to be here, alongside so many colleagues that I respect. But this party taught me that respect, unfortunately, is not a universal rule." And I looked directly at both of them. Silence returned. They stared at me as if they were seeing a ghost. His wife laughed in the corner. The president handed me a folder. And I read, out loud, "As of today, by decision of the board, based on the complaints and evidence presented, so-and-so is temporarily suspended from his duties, under formal investigation." The reaction was a collapse of murmurs, shocked looks, suppressed smiles. But the last piece was still missing. I looked at my wife. She tried to maintain her posture, but her body was shaking. And then I said, "And for the avoidance of doubt, I also filed my marital separation today, based on the evidence of adultery that I gathered over the last few weeks." The glasses fell. Someone sighed loudly. And she collapsed. There was no scandal. There was no screaming. There was only the dry sound of truth being spat out in the center of a party. A truth that could no longer be hidden, erased, disguised. But the story doesn't end there. Because after that, when everyone thought I had won, something even more unexpected happened. And it was there, the day after the party, that an even bigger secret came to light. A hidden, subtle detail that would transform everything again, including how I felt. And it's at this point that everything really changes. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal, on the contrary, we show how it can destroy lives, homes and hearts. All the stories told are fictional, but they reflect real pain that many have faced. The objective is clear, to reveal the devastating consequences of infidelity. Get ready, what you're going to hear now is a shocking story. Let the truth behind the lie begin. Daniel has always been a serene man, with calm speech and restrained gestures, the kind that don't stand out in a noisy environment, but that become unforgettable because of the way they listen, the way they observe. He was methodical, passionate about simple routines, about waking up at the same time, about drinking his coffee with 2 drops of vanilla and whole grain bread cut at symmetrical angles. He was no ordinary man, although he tried hard to appear so. He had a look that overflowed with kindness, but hid a sharp intelligence, capable of perceiving the most subtle changes around him. He worked in the administrative sector of a large technology corporation and, over the years, he earned the respect of his colleagues for his ethics, his emotional stability and, above all, for his discretion. She was the type who preferred compliments in private, who refused company birthday parties and who always brought home flowers on Fridays, even for no apparent reason. For Daniel, small gestures were everything. His wife, Clara, was the opposite in many ways. Communicative, engaging, full of energy, the kind that transforms a trivial conversation into something charming. Clara worked in the marketing sector of the same company as Daniel, and stood out for the charisma with which she conducted meetings, for the enthusiasm she brought to projects, for the way she enchanted even the most difficult clients. She was sweet but ambitious. Elegant but firm. There was something magnetic about her presence, and it was impossible not to notice her when she walked into a room. When she met Daniel, she was surprised by his calmness, by the way he didn't seem to try to impress, and perhaps that was exactly what won her over. Clara said that Daniel was the safe haven that she didn't even know she needed, someone who made her feel like she didn't need to always prove herself, someone who offered peace in such a demanding world. They met 6 years earlier, at a company convention in another city. He was one of the speakers and she was one of the organizers. When their eyes met for the first time, there was an involuntary silence between the two, as if the world had turned down the volume for a few seconds. The connection was almost instantaneous, but delicately constructed. Daniel was neither direct nor invasive. He sent an email the next day thanking him for the impeccable organization of the trip and praising the good taste of the musical choices during the cocktail party. Clara responded with a typed smile and, from there, an exchange of messages began that soon turned into dinners, then weekends, until they became inseparable. They got married 2 years later, in a place surrounded by ancient trees, where guests threw petals instead of rice. The ceremony was small, intimate, only for those closest to us. Daniel preferred it that way. Clara accepted, but made sure to take care of every detail to make it memorable. And it was. In the early years, they built a home together based on respect, complicity and mutual admiration. Each one with their individualities, but always with a pact of balance. Clara understood Daniel's silence, and he, in turn, valued her intensity. It was as if they had found just the right rhythm to coexist without friction. At work, they avoided mixing personal and professional life. They were in different areas, on different floors, and agreed to have lunch together once a week outside the company. It was their moment, a kind of reconnection ritual in the midst of the rush. All colleagues knew they were married, but they never witnessed kisses or exaggerated exchanges of affection. They kept a low profile by choice. Their relationship was admired. Many said they were the perfect couple. Daniel, always kind, was the first to help any colleague. Clara, with her sharp empathy, could make even the most reserved employee open up during motivational campaigns. Over time, they became not only professional references, but personal ones as well. Invited to events, dinners and, occasionally, used as an example in internal lectures on work-life balance. From the outside, everything looked perfect. And in many ways, it really was. They had a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood, with decor that mixed Daniel's minimalism with Clara's vibrant touches. They had 2 cats, which she insisted on dressing with themed bows on commemorative dates, and a small bookshelf where they collected travel books, even though they didn't travel as much as they would like. They had plans, goals, wish lists hanging on the refrigerator with colorful magnets. They planned a long trip for the following year. They spoke about children with a mixture of anxiety and tenderness. Every morning was a fresh start full of small rituals, freshly brewed coffee, quick kisses before leaving, mid-work messages with inside jokes. But as in every real story, beauty also hid cracks. As the years passed, the two began to change in almost imperceptible ways. Daniel started working late, absorbed in reports and strategic meetings. Clara immersed herself in increasingly intense projects, which required nights out, external events, constant interactions with other sectors. Conversations at home became more practical, more objective. They talked about payments, about fixing the car, about planning their trip, but rarely about themselves. Wednesday dinners became fortnightly, then monthly. Sundays on the couch gave way to productive Sundays. Time passed as it passes for everyone, without asking for permission. Even so, Daniel remained attentive. He watched her eyes, trying to identify when she really smiled. He would touch your hand affectionately before going to sleep. I left notes on the coffee table when I left early. Clara, on the other hand, seemed to carry within her an uneasiness that grew silently. She was still loving, but sometimes scattered. Laugh, but less deeply. She seemed to be looking for something beyond what they already had, something that perhaps even she couldn't name. It wasn't about unhappiness. It was more like a diffuse void, which appeared between the silences and smiles, like a dissonant note that no one wants to recognize. During the same period, the company underwent restructuring. New leaders emerged, corporate events became more frequent, intersectoral projects became the new guideline. Clara was invited to join the Strategic Integration Committee, an initiative that involved multiple sectors and sporadic trips to other branches. It was an opportunity she wouldn't refuse. Daniel was supportive, as always, saying he trusted her completely. And he trusted. No reservations. With the same dedication as someone who places their heart in the hands of another. The following weeks were intense. Clara began working in partnership with new colleagues. His schedule became increasingly tight. Daniel waited up for her on the days she arrived late. He made a point of heating up dinner, even when she said it wasn't necessary. In return, she left sweet notes on the bathroom mirror. But there was an uncomfortable feeling in the air, a kind of misalignment between the bodies, a failure in the previously perfect synchrony. Clara seemed more distant, yet present. More tired, even though I laughed. And Daniel, even without understanding why, began to feel a discomfort that he couldn't name. The company party was announced as the big event of the year. It would be a celebration of the company's exponential growth and integration between sectors. Everyone was invited, including companions. It would be in a luxurious hotel, with a full dinner, dance floor and inspiring speeches. Clara was excited. I loved this type of event. Daniel, as always, hesitated. But he decided he would go, for her. He chose a new suit and went to the salon to get a haircut. She would wear a blue dress that she had bought months before and had not yet debuted. The two prepared together, exchanged compliments, laughed. In the car, they talked about how good it would be to see old colleagues again. Clara seemed genuinely excited. Daniel, as always, calm. The entrance to the hall was marked by smiles, hugs and toasts. Clara floated between groups from different sectors, always with the same energy. Daniel watched her from afar, admiring the way she filled the room. He chatted with some colleagues, drank moderately, stayed near the appetizer table. At one point, her eyes met his, and she smiled knowingly. And in that second, he remembered why he had fallen in love with her. How much he was still able to love her. But that night, in that crowded room, something would move. Something that had been silent for too long. One subtle movement, one unexpected gesture, and everything would begin to change. And neither of them were prepared for what was to come. The music danced between the bodies, the soft lights and golden tones reflected in the glasses of sparkling wine that circulated among the guests, and laughter filled the room like an orchestra of collective euphoria. Clara was stunning, enveloped in an energy that seemed amplified by every look she received. She spun between groups with the lightness of someone who belongs everywhere and to no one in particular, but there was a different vibration about her that night, something looser, more pulsating, as if she danced not just with her feet, but with a freedom that escaped even her gestures. Daniel watched from a distance, leaning close to the bar, with his fingers sliding across the glass as if he wanted to decipher what he couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy. It was intuition. The one that can't be explained, just felt. He tried to ignore it, tried to divert the thought, tried to convince himself that it was just the energy of the occasion, but there was something inside him that was twitching. She called him with a subtle wave to dance, and he went, smiling, trying to keep his thoughts at bay. The two danced slowly for a few minutes, like old times, their faces close, their gazes connected, but he felt that, even there, she was distant. Her eyes darted frequently, searching the environment as if waiting for something or someone. He felt it in her touch, which seemed more hurried, less interested in lingering. It didn't last long before she walked away to greet other colleagues, leaving Daniel there, on the dance floor, smiling alone, watching the crowd spin around as the center of his world dissolved before his eyes. And it was during this interval that it happened. A man crossed the room too confidently to be just another guest. He was tall, with a firm presence, a trained smile, and an impeccable suit. He reached Clara without hesitation, and extended his hand to her. Daniel watched everything. He saw the look she gave the man, a mixture of surprise and restrained enthusiasm, like someone who didn't expect it and at the same time wanted it. They greeted each other like old acquaintances. The gesture was brief, but full of intimacy. He said something that made her laugh with a lightness Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. And then, without ceremony, he took her by the hand and led her to the dance floor. Clara didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. He let himself be guided with the naturalness of someone who already knew the path. Daniel felt time freeze. The room was still dancing, the songs were still playing, but nothing was making a sound anymore. All he heard was the echo of his own heart, each beat heavier than the last. His eyes didn't blink. His mind tried to rationalize, but his body already knew. And even then, he didn't move a muscle. The two danced for long minutes. They laughed. Their eyes met frequently. The bodies were too close together for what would be appropriate between coworkers. Daniel didn't just see a dance. He saw a story being told in front of him, and he was the only one who didn't know the plot. Tried to disguise it. Tried to talk to someone. He tried to stay upright as everything around him slowly collapsed. But inside, I was bleeding in silence. When the song ended, the man leaned over and said something in Clara's ear. She smiled, placed her hand on his shoulder, and responded in a way that he couldn't hear, but he could see. It was complicity. It was contained desire. And then they walked away, each one to one side, as if nothing had happened. Daniel spent the rest of the night with a lump stuck in his throat. The smile frozen on his face. The look lost between glasses and greetings. When he arrived home with Clara, she took off her shoes, praised the party, commented on how lively the event was, and then kissed him lightly before going up to take a shower. Daniel stayed in the kitchen, standing still, staring into space, trying to find air. He didn't sleep that night. He just waited for the day to come, in silence, with his eyes fixed on the ceiling and his heart pounding questions that he still didn't know how to ask. From there, something broke, but no one heard the sound. Over the next few days, Daniel began to observe more closely. Every gesture, every look, every laugh from Clara started to be analyzed in layers. She said she was overworked, that the new projects were demanding a lot from her, that sometimes she would leave later because of meetings with other sectors. Daniel pretended to understand. He responded with kisses, with dinners ready, with coffees left by the bed. But inside him, a ground was already beginning to crack. He decided to act cautiously. I wouldn't confront. Not yet. I preferred certainty to doubt. I preferred the weight of a truth to the torture of a maybe. Hired a private investigator. Not because he was paranoid, but because he needed the clarity that his eyes could no longer provide. Meanwhile, Clara continued with her routine of smiles, meetings, and out-of-hours departures. She continued to be affectionate, attentive in small doses, loving enough to maintain the appearance of normality. But Daniel felt it. More and more. And what was intuition started to become certainty with the information that arrived. Photos, schedules, meetings in remote cafes, intercepted messages. Everything connected. And between each new detail revealed, a piece of Daniel died in silence. It was on a rainy Sunday, while Clara was preparing pancakes and Daniel was pretending to watch the news, that the final straw arrived. The investigator sent a recording of a meeting that occurred 2 days earlier. A discreet dinner in a low-light restaurant. Clara and the man at the party. The two sat side by side, hands that touched frequently, gazes that lingered. At one point, the man brought his hand to Clara's face and caressed her cheek. She closed her eyes for a moment, then smiled and kissed him. There was no longer any room for doubt. Betrayal was no longer a whisper, it was a scream. Daniel turned off the video. He put his cell phone in his pocket and calmly stood up, thanking him for the pancakes. And once again, he pretended. That night, she slept first. As I always did in the last few months. Daniel remained sitting on the edge of the bed, watching the sleeping face of the woman he chose to love, the woman he had supported emotionally for years, the woman he dreamed of growing old with. He watched in silence, trying to understand when exactly she stopped being his. And as much as it hurt, something inside him told him there was still something he didn't know. Some piece out of place. A detail that had not yet emerged. But whatever it was, it would come to light. He got up, covered her with the duvet, and left the room. The night was long. And what would come, he knew, would change everything forever. The next day, he went to work as if nothing had happened. He passed through the corridor greeting his colleagues, entered the meeting room, participated in presentations, made discreet jokes with his usual peers. But within himself, there was no longer room for anything other than strategy. He knew what he needed to do. And it wouldn't just be a conversation. He wanted her to taste the choice she made. To look in the mirror and see the real reflection of the woman she has become. But to do so, he needed to wait for the right moment. And he was close. The following week, Clara was called to a new company event, a get-together between strategic sectors. An integration dinner, like so many others. But this one, Daniel knew, would be different. He had already made the right invitations, articulated the details, confirmed the necessary attendance. And when she entered the room, next to the man with whom she shared hidden glances, Daniel was already there, waiting. She didn't see him right away. He was smiling, radiant. As if the world still belonged to him. And for a brief moment, Daniel almost faltered. But then he remembered the recording. From the kiss. From the lie on the face of those who swear love. It was exactly there, at that moment, that Daniel knew the time had come. And what would come next, he had already rehearsed in silence for nights on end. But what he himself didn't imagine was that behind that betrayal, there was still something much bigger hidden. Something that would forever change everything he thought he knew. The party room was full, the atmosphere seemed lighter than usual, maybe it was the music, maybe it was the wine, maybe it was the excessive laughter of people trying to appear whole in a world of appearances. Clara was at the center of everything, moving around naturally, as if that environment had been designed for her. Daniel was already there, as calm as ever, only now with his eyes more attentive than ever. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit, his face as calm as the surface of a lake on a windless day, but inside, a hurricane was gaining strength. The lover's wife was positioned among the guests, in a light conversation with one of the HR leaders, smiling like someone who has not yet revealed that she is about to open the door to hell. The lover, glass in hand, walked around confidently, greeting everyone with an air of superiority that Daniel knew well. He was the kind of man who thought nothing could touch him, who mastered the backstage of emotions, who walked around like he owned the place. And at that moment, the certainty that he had no idea what was coming next made everything even more enjoyable. When the music stopped and the microphone was handed to Clara so that she, as part of the events committee, could give a short thank you speech, Daniel approached the center of the room and stopped in front of her. The silence was immediate, as if everyone knew that something out of protocol was about to happen. Clara, surprised, smiled, not knowing if that was part of the program. The lover, further away, slightly raised his eyebrow. Daniel excused himself, gently took the microphone from his hands and walked to the center of the room. The lover's wife stepped forward, without announcing herself. The surroundings became dense, as if the air had thickened. Daniel looked at Clara with a serenity that froze his smile. She tried to understand the discomfort already taking shape, but she still maintained her composure. It was then that, with a firm voice, Daniel thanked everyone for coming and then passed the floor to someone with something important to share. The woman to his right took the microphone and didn't hesitate. With an erect posture, she declared that she was not just there as the wife of one of the guests, but as the wife of a man who had chosen to destroy 2 families with his own hands. And with a precise gesture, he pointed to his lover, who at that moment completely lost the shine in his eyes. The murmur was immediate. Tension passed through the room like lightning from a clear sky. The wife revealed the affair between her husband and Clara, mentioned dates, places, and even showed screenshots of messages. Clara took a step back, visibly shaken. He tried to deny it, tried to maintain his dignity, but the woman's words were sharp, irrefutable. When he finished, he handed the microphone back to Daniel with a smile of pain and victory, and left the room, without looking back. Daniel stood there, motionless, with the microphone in his hands. Everyone was waiting for him to say something. And he said. With a clear voice, he thanked everyone again for their presence and announced that, from that moment on, his marital relationship with Clara was over. He declared that trust had been irreparably broken and that he would not comply with a lie sustained by silence. The words were harsh, but spoken with devastating calm. Clara tried to get closer, mumbling that they could talk, that it wasn't the place, that they were exposing too much. But he didn't listen to her. He just left the stage, crossed the room and stopped in front of the man who destroyed his home. With his eyes fixed on him, he handed over an envelope and said that it contained the company's formal notification of his suspension, an internal investigation and the re-evaluation of his ethical conduct as an employee, based on accusations that were no longer just personal, but corporate. The lover was left without reaction. He tried to laugh, disguise it, deny it, but the faces around him had already become silent judges. The crowd was now no longer an audience, it was a court. Daniel left the center of the room without looking back, leaving an uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. But the real twist had not yet been revealed. In the following days, as the news of the betrayal spread through the company's corridors and Clara's image crumbled amid whispers and crossed looks, something even bigger began to take shape. She tried to talk to Daniel, tried to arrange meetings, send messages, rewrite her version of the story. But he didn't respond. I was focused on another part of the plan, deeper, more strategic, more destructive. What no one knew was that, in the previous weeks, Daniel had already started getting closer to the betrayed woman. A subtle movement, built on the shared pain and sincerity of 2 who were broken by the same lie. They started talking through formal messages, then exchanging confidences about their disappointments, and over time, they developed an unexpected complicity. She had been the first to notice her husband's pattern of behavior, the first to suspect that something was wrong, but she lacked proof. Daniel provided each one. She, in turn, revealed something that made his eyes widen for the first time in weeks. The lover was not just a company employee. He had achieved his position through family influence, as his wife was the niece of the company's vice president, and everything he had built had been built in silence, ignoring codes of conduct, internal bidding and ethical relationships. What Daniel believed to be just a marital betrayal was also a structure of abuse of power, a dirty corporate game, supported by hidden relationships. And more, Clara knew. She knew that her lover was married. I knew about the connection with the top management. She knew that getting closer to him could benefit her. And yet, it moved forward. Participated. Silenced. Profited. The secret was there, out in the open. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. Clara had gotten involved with that man for more than desire. There was a veiled intention of professional growth, of access to areas that were not previously open to him, of positioning in sectors where simple competence was no longer enough. Clara, who had shown integrity for so long, had transformed into a player. And she was no longer the woman Daniel had loved. It was another. With other values, other desires, other choices. Faced with the revelation, Daniel understood everything. The averted glances, the unexpected trips, the recommendations for projects that seemed to come out of nowhere. He understood that his marriage was used as a showcase, a facade of stability, while behind it was articulated an ascension based on manipulation. The impact was so profound that for a moment he thought about not reacting. In just disappearing. But he decided not to. That it would not be silenced. That she would see what it cost to play with the trust of someone she loved. At the board meeting, Daniel presented detailed evidence of their involvement, not only in personal betrayal, but in the misuse of the company's structure for his own benefit. There were traces of conversations, transfers of privileged information, use of internal data to strengthen Clara's image with the presidency. And, in front of the full panel, the decision was unanimous: both would be dismissed from the company, without the right to bonuses or recommendations. But the final blow was yet to come. In a final move, Daniel requested that the dismissal be formalized during a general meeting, as a way of reinforcing the company's ethical commitment. The board accepted. And Clara, without knowing it, was called to present a project at that same meeting. When she entered the room, she saw all the faces turn towards her. Among them, Daniel, calm, next to the HR director. And it was there, in front of everyone, that he received his termination letter. And he knew that, in addition to his marriage, he had lost everything he thought he had achieved. She stood still, speechless. She tried to talk to him, but he just said, in an almost inaudible tone, that justice sometimes didn't come with shouting, but with the exact weight of silence. Clara left the room with teary eyes, her face drained of color, her body shaking. And Daniel stood there, firm, knowing that everything had changed. But what he didn't expect, was that that story still had a final chapter. Something that no one, including him, could predict. Something that would turn everything around once again. Clara's departure from the company was not silent. She left the building with dry eyes, but inside she was an uncontrolled hurricane. He passed through the lobby feeling the looks that didn't need to be direct to hurt. He didn't cry there, he didn't let his despair show. He got into the car, started the engine with a shaking hand, but didn't drive. She stood still, both hands on the steering wheel, trying to understand how reality could change so brutally in such a short time. It wasn't just the exposure, the dismissal, the public trial. It was the realization that the control he believed he had carefully constructed was completely out of his hands. And what hurt most was knowing that everything had been articulated with precision by the man who, until recently, she thought was too predictable to be dangerous. Daniel not only found out about the betrayal. He disarmed her every step with intelligence. And he did it without screaming, without destroying himself. Yes, she was destroyed. Meanwhile, he walked another path, not lightly, but with determination. Public exposure had been necessary. The wound needed to be opened in front of everyone so that there would be no doubts. But there was more to resolve, and it was no longer about revenge. It was something deeper, quieter. Daniel knew there were cracks inside him that would never be repaired. I wasn't looking for a fresh start. I sought understanding. And yet, something unexpected began to emerge from the chaos. A new presence, unexpected, discreet, but firm. Helena. Helena was the name of the woman betrayed by Clara's lover. After the night of the party, they remained in contact, not out of convenience, but out of a mutual need for understanding. There was no rush, nor declared intention. Just sincere exchanges of words between two who understood each other without having to explain. She is different from Clara in everything. Serenity in the eyes, calm voice, and a pain that, instead of imploding, had transformed into lucidity. Daniel met her again a few weeks later, in a small cafe, outside the center, far from everything. They talked about the legal processes, about rebuilding their routine, and in the midst of it all, they laughed for the first time. Conversations became meetings, long walks. There were no plans, there were no camouflage desires. Just a calm presence that reminded him that it was still possible to be with someone without carrying the weight of a performance. Helena didn't ask questions that would put him against the wall. She listened, understood, gave back with sensitivity. And Daniel realized, little by little, that his life was beginning to have a new rhythm. The house that previously seemed too big for just one person started to take on a different tone when she showed up with flowers, or just for a coffee. It wasn't about replacement. It was reconstruction. And she knew it. He never tried to occupy a space that wasn't his. He just offered his own space, and he, exhausted, accepted. While Daniel resumed in silence, Clara sank into noisy chaos. The local media began to speculate about the dismissal of two well-known names from the company, although without mentioning the details. Internal groups leaked photos, audios, screenshots. And social networks, merciless, did the rest of the work. She lost invitations to industry events, had a personal project cancelled by sponsors and, worse, started to be avoided by people who had previously fawned over her. The hypocrisy of social circles did not forgive unvarnished scandals. He tried old contacts, but found doors closed. He tried to explain, but no one wanted to listen. He looked for Daniel more than once. By phone. By email. Once he even rang the doorbell at home. He didn't answer. Until one day, he found Helena leaving there. The shock was immediate. Clara remained inside the car, watching from a distance. The image of the two of them together struck something she couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy. It was a loss. It was confirmation that everything, absolutely everything, was beyond his reach. He started the engine and drove away, swallowing hard. The following week, a letter arrived for Daniel. Handwriting. Clara said she was not looking for reconciliation or forgiveness. I just wanted him to know that he now understood the extent of what he had done. That it wasn't just an emotional betrayal, but a breaking of everything they had built. That she herself had lost herself in a vanity game that was never about love. She said she didn't expect an answer, and that she sincerely wanted him to be happy. Daniel read each line carefully. He didn't get emotional, he didn't smile, he didn't hate. Just understood. And he kept the letter in a drawer, along with other souvenirs that no longer had a place on the visible shelves. The divorce process was finalized discreetly. Clara gave up the house. He only asked to keep some personal items. Daniel did not create obstacles. Helena was at his side during the final procedures, not as an official partner, but as a presence. And that was more valuable than any statement. Time continued with its impartial rhythm. Months later, Daniel was invited to speak at an event on corporate ethics. He took the stage, spoke firmly, did not mention names, but shared his experience with an honesty that touched everyone. He spoke about loyalty, about limits, about how power, when misused, destroys not only companies, but lives. He received a standing ovation. At the end of the lecture, Helena was waiting for him at the back of the room, with that look that said more than any words. Clara, in turn, moved to another city. It started again far away. Not as punishment, but as escape. She needed to rebuild herself without the looks that reminded her of what she was. He started teaching communication classes at a smaller college, and little by little, he began to relearn how to listen. He didn't talk to anyone about Daniel again. I kept that part of my life as something too precious to be exposed again. Like a pain that becomes learning, even if too late. And it was just a year later that, one spring afternoon, Daniel walked with Helena through a park and, without planning, held her hand. She looked at him with contained surprise, and he just smiled, as if he had finally found peace. They didn't say anything. They just continued walking, side by side, while the world around them seemed, for the first time in a long time, silent and right. But deep down, even with everything rebuilt, even with serenity achieved, a single question still existed. And this question, Daniel would only ask once. In a last conversation, in a last gesture. Because, even after all the pain, something still needed to be said. And maybe, just maybe, it was in that answer that he would finally understand everything. The last conversation was unplanned, but inevitable. Time had passed enough to allow silence, but not to completely eliminate the residue of what was once profound. It was an end that needed to be sealed with the truth that had not yet been told. Not out of desire for reconciliation, nor out of anger. But because there are questions that refuse to die until the answer is given. Daniel learned that Clara would return to the city for a few days. It wasn't a secret. She would come to resolve pending documents and an apartment that she had not yet managed to sell. The news came to him from an old colleague, casually, without emotional charge, like a footnote on an almost forgotten page. But something inside him reacted, not with restlessness, but with clarity. There was an unspoken word between the two. And he needed to hear it. It was he who sent the message, simple and direct. "Can we talk before you get back?" The answer came quickly. Yes. They marked it in a neutral place, without links to memories. A stone bench under a tree in the center of a park they had rarely visited together. When Clara arrived, she had an expression on her face that was no longer one of guilt or shame, but of someone who had learned, by force, the value of choices and the cost of deviations. She sat down carefully, and the silence between them lasted longer than expected. Until Daniel, with his eyes fixed on the falling leaves, asked what had been haunting his thoughts for a long time. "Would you have done all that if you knew I knew from the beginning?" Clara didn't respond immediately. She took a deep breath, and only then looked up at him. He said he didn't know. That maybe yes, maybe no. Who, at that time, believed that everything was under control, that he dominated the game, that nothing would go beyond the script he had drawn. But what she didn't expect was to get lost along the way. She said that, at a certain point, she began to no longer recognize herself, that she looked in the mirror and saw someone who molded herself too much to the environment, to expectations, to power disguised as desire. That the betrayal was a consequence of an internal process of erosion and not an isolated gesture of evil. But still, there was no excuse. Daniel heard everything in silence. He didn't interrupt. Didn't respond. When she finished, he just shook his head. And then he said he forgave. Not as someone who forgets, but as someone who decides to no longer carry the weight of others. Clara cried, but didn't ask to start over. I knew there was no more space. He got up, thanked him and left without looking back. And Daniel, when he saw her leave, felt not relief, but a discreet peace. The cycle had ended. In the days that followed, life continued with the tranquility of someone who had survived a storm without losing their values. Daniel returned to dedicate himself more deeply to his work, now with a new purpose. He began leading projects focused on ethics and organizational integrity, giving voice to topics that were previously treated as taboo. He became an internal and external reference, not because of the scandal he experienced, but because of the way he reacted to it. Pain became authority. Silence became an example. And his stance began to inspire others not to remain silent in the face of abuse disguised as charm. Helena remained by his side, but not as a replacement or as a redemption. It was a relationship built on truths, without rushing, without the need for spectacle. They were two hurting adults who chose to treat each other with kindness. And that was enough. Their conversations went beyond pain. They talked about books, about politics, about food, about the future. She had renovated a small studio where she painted during the weekends. Daniel liked to see her creating, as if each color was a new beginning. He accompanied her to small exhibitions, sometimes helped carry canvases, and, in silence, allowed her lightness to fill spaces that were once filled with anguish. But, despite the reconstruction, there was a dilemma that never left Daniel's mind. Something that started to grow slowly inside him and that started to bother him as the months went by. It was a question that didn't concern Clara, nor Helena, but himself. How fair had his response to the betrayal been? To what extent were the public unmasking, the strategic dismissal, the brutal breakup acts of courage or just a sophisticated form of revenge? Doubt didn't take away his sleep, but it poked at his conscience. He knew he hadn't been cruel on impulse, but he also knew that, in his pain, he used his power with calculated precision. And, in that use, there was something that brought him closer to the very Clara he had condemned. He then started talking about it with Helena, who listened to him attentively. She didn't judge him, but she didn't soften what he felt either. He said that justice and revenge sometimes arise from the same root, and that time is what defines whether something was necessary or just reactive. Daniel began to review his actions, not to blame himself, but to understand. He knew he needed to come to terms with his own choice. And he did. He realized that, although he exposed Clara and her lover, he did not do it to humiliate, but to cut a line of silence that could have swallowed the company itself. The exposure, although painful, had prevented the pattern from repeating itself in other spheres. It had served something bigger. This didn't make the process any easier, but it made it at least bearable. One afternoon, while walking with Helena along the banks of a lake, he stopped, looked at her and said that, for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. Helena smiled, held his hand, and they followed in silence, leaving light footprints in the damp earth. Meanwhile, Clara reappeared in an interview with a smaller communication channel. He didn't mention Daniel, nor the details of what happened. He just talked about how it is possible to get lost when you pursue something without questioning your own limits. He said he was starting over, that he was teaching and learning at the same time. His face no longer carried the haughtiness it had before, but a more sober, more real expression. When Daniel watched the interview, he didn't feel hatred or longing. He felt only understanding. And perhaps, deep down, a hint of gratitude that everything happened the way it did. Because it was necessary to lose everything to find yourself again. Months later, unexpected news arrived. Clara had written a book. Not about the scandal, but about emotional ethics in the corporate environment. The title was simple but strong. And on the first pages, there was a dedication, to those who showed me the weight of choice. Daniel received the copy with surprise. He read in silence, page by page, and at the end, he closed the book with a slight smile. Life sometimes teaches through pain what love could not explain. And for some, it is necessary to lose ground to learn to walk again. But the real ending had not yet arrived. Because there was one last invitation. One last step to be taken. And in it, there would be the answer to a question that Daniel had kept silent since the beginning. A question about starting over, about courage, about allowing yourself to live, once again, with an open heart. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope, with thin, elegant letters. A discreet varnish revealed that it was not a simple card. Inside, the announcement of an exhibition, Helena's first in a respected gallery, now recognized not only for her technical talent, but for the emotional charge of the works that carried, like silent scars, everything she had experienced. Among the paintings, one stood out with a name that would say little to the public, but to Daniel, it was everything. Start. An abstract portrait, without faces, but which revealed in its lines the exact feeling of starting over when you already imagined yourself incapable of feeling again. He dressed simply and arrived at the event with the calmness of someone who had made peace with his past. When Helena saw him enter, she smiled with the same serenity that had accompanied him since the first coffee. They didn't say anything right away. They just looked at each other with the complicity of someone who had walked, side by side, without rushing, until that moment. And there, in the middle of the crowd, without fanfare, he held her hand and asked if she wanted to build a new story with him, without empty promises, without pressure, just with the truth that brought them together from the beginning. Helena didn't respond with words, just shook his hand. And in that gesture, he knew that he no longer needed to look for certainty, because he had already found it. Clara, in turn, gave her last class that semester with a firm voice, without tremors. The students applauded her at the end, not for her performance, but for her presence. She had become an educator capable of teaching more with her vulnerability than with repeated theories. Upon leaving the room, he crossed the corridor slowly, aware that that cycle was also ending. He decided it was time to go deeper into his reconstruction. She looked for a therapist and began working with women who had faced what she had faced, not as victims, but as agents of their own new beginnings. Wrote more. Published articles. And, without realizing it, his story began to discreetly inspire others. One day, upon receiving an anonymous email from a reader saying that she had given up on making the same mistake after reading her text, Clara cried in silence. Not out of remorse, but out of understanding that, even from a mistake, it was possible to generate something good. Clara's ex-lover followed another path. After the public exposure, he tried to maintain appearances, moving to another city and taking on another position in a smaller company. But the truth, even in disguise, has a smell that doesn't hide for long. In less than a year, he was involved in a harassment scandal and fired again. The connections that once sustained him have now turned their backs. Isolated, without prestige, he began to make a living from sporadic consultancies, avoiding exposure. Some said he was trying to rebuild his image, others that he was just hiding. The fact is that he never had the same sparkle in his eyes again. And deep down, he knew that what he lost was more than a job or a marriage. He lost his own reflection in the mirror. Helena and Daniel, over time, decided to merge their houses into one. Not out of necessity, but out of desire. They created a light, silent space, full of plants, books and paintings. It wasn't a new house. It was a house built on truth. They lived without rushing, without demands. They traveled when they could. They laughed more than they planned. Sometimes they talked about the past naturally, without pain. They had understood that there is no redemption where there is silence, but also that pain, if looked at head-on, can be the beginning of something greater. Daniel found his passion for writing again. He started a book on ethics and emotional reconstruction. Helena illustrated the covers. And, together, they discovered that love, when true, does not require a spectacle. Just presence. Years later, Clara met Daniel again by chance, at a conference on emotional integrity. Both were guest speakers. They exchanged looks, formal greetings, and a brief smile. Nothing else was needed. They had already said everything they needed to. And, at the end of that day, each one went a different path, but with the certainty that, even after all the destruction, they had managed to become better versions of themselves. The impact of the choices reverberated for a long time. Friends moved away, others approached. Families reorganized. But everyone involved left changed. Neither better nor worse. Just more aware. Betrayal was not the end. It was the door to a truer beginning. And although none of them wanted to go through all that, they knew that if it hadn't happened, they might still be trapped in a charade that was preventing them from growing. And now, with this story complete, there is a reflection. How far can love endure silence? What are we left with when trust is broken? And how do we move forward when everything we knew about each other, and ourselves, no longer makes sense? The answer, as we have seen, is not in immediate forgiveness, nor in empty punishment. It's in the courage to look the truth in the eyes and decide not to be defined by the error, but by the way we choose to rebuild what's left. If you made it this far, comment below what you thought of this story. What was the most memorable moment for you? What decision would you have made in Daniel's, Clara's, Helena's place? Your opinion is very important to us. And of course, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity now to subscribe and activate notifications. Here, you will hear intense, real and transformative stories. And remember, this channel does not support or romanticize any type of betrayal. Our goal is to show how wrong decisions can change lives forever, and how the truth, no matter how painful it may be, is always the best path. Until next time.